What if the God of the Old Testament wasn't actually testing Job's faith at all?
Right, what if it was something else entirely?
Yeah. Like, what if he was instead trying to hide his own profound, unexamined insecurities?
It's a staggering thought.
It really is. Welcome to the deep dive, by the way. Our mission today is, well, it's unlike anything we've tackled before.
Definitely. It's a massive undertaking.
We are exploring one of the most provocative, mind-bending psychological analyses of religion ever put to paper. We're going to examine how human consciousness itself evolves by grappling with the concept of a flawed, contradictory divine force.
And to do this, we really have to undergo a complete paradigm shift in how we approach these familiar texts.
Exactly. So let's lay out our sources. Our primary text today is a huge excerpt from the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung's highly controversial 1952 book.
Right. Answer to Job.
Yeah, specifically the 2010 Princeton edition with Sonu Shamdasani's foreword.
We'll also be weaving in some crucial concepts from this brief but incredibly potent guide titled Escaping the Illusion, Agnostic Beginner's Guide.
I love that guide. We're going to focus heavily on the section's first steps to escape and the missing keys.
But before we go a single step further, we really need to establish some ground rules for you, the listener.
Yes, absolutely essential. We are not taking theological or political sides here.
Right. We are not trying to prove or disprove the existence of a literal deity.
Not at all. We are strictly exploring Jung's psychological interpretation of biblical narratives. It's an exercise in understanding human thought, archetypes, and, the evolution of human consciousness.
We are treating this text purely as an analysis of the human psyche's relationship with the divine image.
So it's about psychology. It's about the structure of the mind and how we project our internal cosmos outward.
And that framing is so important because if we try to read this as literal theology, the entire framework just, well, it collapses.
And frankly, people get very upset.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what happened when the book was first published.
Yeah, I mean, Jung didn't just casually sit down and outline Answer to Job on a Sunday afternoon, right?
No, not at all. He wrote it in this one explosive, almost violent burst of energy while he was recovering from a high fever.
Wow.
Yeah, he actually wrote in a letter that he felt he had, quote, landed the great whale.
Landed the great whale. The sheer force of that fever dream intensity, you can really feel it in the text.
You definitely can.
I was reading about the actual physical production of the manuscript, and his own secretary, Marie-Jean Schmid, was deeply upset while she was typing it.
Oh, I remember that. Her ancestors were Protestant pastors, right?
Yes, and she was in absolute revolt over what he was dictating. She found it profoundly blasphemous.
And Jung knew it?
He totally did. He later wrote, "The clouds of dust it has raised at times nearly suffocated me."
He knew he was handling psychological dynamite. He was dismantling a deeply ingrained worldview.
So to understand this great whale that Jung landed, we have to start exactly where he starts, which is redefining what we mean by truth.
Right, we have to move entirely away from historical literalism.
And start looking at what Jung calls psychic facts.
Yes. Jung argues that centuries of religious conflicts, schisms, and, theological debates arise entirely because people confuse physical truth with psychic truth.
Let's ground this concept for the listener, because when we hear the word fact, our modern post-Enlightenment brains immediately go to, well, something that can be weighed.
Weighed, measured, carbon dated.
Right. We want a physical artifact.
Precisely. Let's take the virgin birth of Christ as an example.
Look, a good example.
For 2,000 years, people have engaged in these incredibly sterile, endless debates about whether a virgin birth is biologically, physically possible.
Skeptics point to biology and say it's physically impossible, therefore it's a lie.
Exactly. And literalists bend over backward trying to invent these pseudoscientific explanations to prove it could happen physically.
And Jung steps into the middle of this and basically says both sides are asking entirely the wrong question.
Because physical impossibility does not invalidate the image.
Right.
It doesn't invalidate it because the virgin birth is a psychic fact. It is a reality of the human soul and the collective unconscious.
So it requires absolutely zero physical, biological proof to be profoundly, fundamentally true.
Yes.
It makes me think of an analogy. If I have a vivid, terrifying nightmare about a monster chasing me through a labyrinth, and I wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding at 150 beats per minute.
Your body is reacting physically.
Exactly. Arguing with me about whether that monster is biologically real completely misses the point of the experience.
Right, the terror you felt in that dream is real.
The physiological response is real. The psychological impact that might, ruin my entire day or reveal a deep-seated anxiety I've been ignoring, that is entirely real.
That is a perfect parallel. Religious statements, according to Jung, are utterances of the soul.
Utterances of the soul. I love that phrasing.
They are filtered through the medium of human consciousness. When a society collectively holds on to an image like the virgin birth or a world-ending flood,
Or the resurrection.
right, they are expressing a profound psychological reality about purity, rebirth, or the overwhelming power of the unconscious.
And this brings up Jung's concept of the autonomous psyche, right?
Exactly. The images we use for God, whether it's a burning bush, an old man in the sky with a white beard, or an eternally flowing current of energy, these are anthropomorphic models.
They're metaphors created by our minds.
Metaphors pointing to unknowable transcendental archetypes that exist way beyond our conscious grasp.
And he brings up the early Christian theologian Tertullian to back this up, which I found fascinating.
Yeah, it's an interesting choice.
Because Tertullian isn't exactly a modern psychoanalyst.
No, not at all. He was writing in the 2nd century.
But Jung highlights Tertullian's brilliant concept of the testimony of the soul.
Right. Tertullian essentially argued that nature is the mistress and the soul is the disciple.
Meaning the human soul innately knows its creator.
Exactly. Even without formal dogma, without scripture, without a priest telling it what to believe.
And the psychological implication that Jung draws from this is massive.
What's fascinating here is that treating religious figures as independent subjects with their own psychology allows us to psychoanalyze God.
Just as we would psychoanalyze a human being sitting on a therapist's couch, we don't just have to bow down in blind terror. We can observe them.
Exactly.
I have to pause here, though, because any listener sitting at home right now might be thinking, well, if these are just psychic images, aren't we essentially just talking to ourselves in an empty room?
That is such a common pushback.
Right? Like, if the God we are analyzing is just a mirror reflecting human psychology, where does the reverence come from? Where does the power come from?
And that is the ultimate trap of modern rationalism. The idea that if something is psychological, it is somehow weak or controllable or just a passing thought.
Right, just a daydream.
But Jung is incredibly careful to clarify the idea of numinosity. When we talk about these archetypes, we are not talking about daydreaming.
So what is numinosity exactly?
Numinosity refers to the tremendous, unassailable, almost terrifying emotional power of these archetypes. They possess
A magical effectiveness?
yes, an overwhelming energetic charge that bypasses the rational mind entirely.
It's like the feeling of standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon or being caught in a massive thunderstorm.
Absolutely.
It's that feeling of absolute awe and absolute insignificance all at once.
Yes. When you encounter a numinous archetype in the psyche, it absolutely does not feel like you are talking to yourself. It feels alien.
It feels overpowering.
Jung says it feels like you are encountering the ens realissimum, a philosophical term meaning the most real being, the ultimate reality.
Wow.
The psychological impact is so staggering, so life-altering, that it forces the human mind to recognize these archetypes as autonomous subjects.
They act upon us. We do not invent them on purpose. And that distinction changes everything about how we read this text. It means if we treat the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, as an autonomous psychological subject,
A character generated by the collective human psyche bursting with this terrifying mana.
we can actually build a character profile. We can look at his actions across the text and ask, what kind of personality is driving this behavior?
And if we do that honestly, setting aside our preconceived theological need for God to be perfect, the personality that emerges is deeply conflicted.
Highly contradictory.
Very much so. It is a personality characterized by immense contradictions, which leads us directly to the traumatic events of the book of Job.
But we cannot understand Job in a vacuum, right? We have to look at Yahweh's track record beforehand.
Exactly. We need to see the psychological baseline. Because Yahweh in the Bible is not a static character. He evolves.
Before the book of Job, Yahweh had established these massive cosmic legal contracts, covenants with humanity.
Like the rainbow with Noah after the flood.
Right, which was a literal visual promise not to destroy the world again in a fit of rage. And then, crucially for this psychological profile, there was the eternal covenant with King David.
The Davidic covenant is central to understanding the crisis. In Psalm 89, the text lays it out explicitly.
And what does it say?
Yahweh says, "My steadfast love I will keep for him forever. I will not violate my covenant or alter the word that went forth from my lips."
It is presented as an ironclad, eternal guarantee.
But then history happens.
The Babylonians invade, the temple is destroyed.
The Davidic crown is defiled in the dust. The kingdom falls.
And to the ancient Israelites and to a modern reader looking at the text chronologically, this reveals a terrifying unreliability in the divine profile.
Absolutely. The absolute moral authority of the universe essentially committed perjury.
You expect God to be morally superior to man, not prone to breaking contracts.
Right. So if we look at the psychological mechanism at play here, we see a profile of Yahweh that is incredibly complex and, frankly, highly dangerous to be around.
He is a deity of totality.
Yes. He contains absolute perfect justice, but he also contains its total opposite, arbitrary, chaotic destruction.
He is entirely amoral in the way a hurricane or an earthquake is amoral.
Exactly. He possesses unimaginable destructive power, right alongside moments of tender, loving kindness.
But the crucial piece, the piece that drives the entire psychological drama of Job, is that Yahweh lacks the conscious reflection to integrate these opposites.
He doesn't seem to realize that he's contradictory. He demands constant praise.
He constantly needs humans to sing psalms about his justice and his righteousness.
Think about that from a psychological perspective. If a human being demands constant, daily praise for a specific virtue,
Like someone who constantly needs you to tell them how generous they are.
right, what does that usually indicate?
It indicates that deep down they feel profoundly insecure about that exact trait.
Precisely. They lack the self-reflection to know their own worth, so they need external validation to prop up their identity.
So Yahweh needs human beings to reflect his existence and his goodness back to him because he is unconscious of his own dark side.
This is a stark contrast to other ancient deities. Take the Greek pantheon, for example.
Oh, like Zeus.
Yeah, Zeus is relatively detached. He sits on Olympus. He pursues his own desires. He throws a thunderbolt if a mortal gets arrogant.
Steps out of line.
Right. But he's not agonizing over the internal moral state of every single human being.
He doesn't need humans to tell him he's Zeus.
Exactly. Yahweh, on the other hand, is intensely, personally, almost suffocatingly obsessed with human beings. He needs them.
It paints a picture of an incredibly powerful, incredibly insecure, archaic king.
It really does.
Imagine a monarch with absolute life and death power over the entire globe, but who requires a massive choir of yes men surrounding his throne 24/7.
Assuring him that he exists, that he is just, that he is good.
He needs this because he doesn't actually possess the internal self-awareness to know who he really is.
But any listener who grew up in a traditional religious environment is going to immediately raise a massive theological defense here.
Oh, for sure. The traditional defense is God is omniscient. He's all-knowing.
He knows the past, present, and future. He knows the number of hairs on your head.
Right. So how can an omniscient being possibly lack self-reflection? How can he be unconscious of his own nature?
It feels like an unsolvable paradox.
If you know everything, you must know yourself.
But Jung provides a brilliant psychological distinction to solve this paradox.
What is it?
Having absolute knowledge stored in the mind is not the same thing as actively consulting that knowledge.
Oh, wow. That is profound.
We see this in human psychology all the time. A person might intellectually know that lashing out in anger will ruin their relationship.
The knowledge is there.
But when they are swept up in an intense emotional affect, when the anger takes over, they act entirely unconsciously.
They don't consult their knowledge.
Yahweh is a being of infinite dynamism, infinite energy. He gets so swept up in his own emotional effects, his intense jealousy, his wrath, his pride,
That he effectively acts unconsciously. He is blinded by his own raw power.
he doesn't pause to reflect on his omniscience. He just reacts.
So if we look at the board as it's set, just before the book of Job begins, we have a terrifyingly volatile combination.
We really do.
We have a deity with infinite cosmos-shattering power. We have intense jealousy and an absolute obsession with how humanity perceives him.
And we have a complete and total lack of self-reflection or integration of his own dark impulses.
It is a psychological powder keg waiting for a spark.
And that spark arrives in the form of a doubting thought.
Yeah.
arrives in the form of his son, Satan.
Let's step into the book of Job. The setup is written almost like a play in a divine throne room, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Satan is wandering the earth, and in this context, Satan isn't the guy with the pitchfork ruling hell.
No, he is acting essentially as Yahweh's doubting eye, the adversary, the trickster figure within the divine court.
And Yahweh points out Job, almost bragging. He says, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man."
And Satan, representing the cynical, doubting aspect of the psyche, insinuates that Job is only faithful because Yahweh has bribed him.
Right. Satan says, "Does Job fear God for naught? You've put a hedge around him and his house. You've blessed the work of his hands."
But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face.
Now, if Yahweh were truly consulting his omniscience, he would know instantly that Job's faith is genuine.
He would look at Satan and say, "I know Job's heart. You're wrong." End of discussion.
But instead, Yahweh instantly yields to this slander. He hands his most loyal servant over to be tortured.
It's brutal.
Job loses his massive wealth, his servants are slaughtered, all of his sons and daughters are crushed to death when a whirlwind destroys their house.
And Job himself is afflicted with loathsome, agonizing sores from head to toe.
We have to ask the psychological question. Why does Yahweh yield so easily?
Jung views this as a massive moral failure, driven by the mechanism of psychological projection.
Projection.
Think back to the broken covenant with David. Yahweh is the one who broke his promise. Yahweh is the one who is unreliable.
Oh, I see.
But because Yahweh lacks self-reflection, he cannot bear the tension of his own unfaithfulness. The unconscious mind cannot handle that contradiction, so it projects it outward.
He projects his own unfaithfulness onto Job.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yahweh suspects Job of potential unfaithfulness because Yahweh is secretly unfaithful,
He projects his own internal doubt onto his most perfect, faithful servant.
and subjects him to unimaginable torture simply to prove a point to his cynical slanderer.
It is a staggering abuse of power born entirely out of psychological insecurity.
And to make this horrific situation even worse, Job's friends show up.
Oh, the friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar.
And instead of sitting in the ashes and comforting him, they offer this relentless, terrible, moralizing drivel.
They look at Job's suffering and they essentially say, well, God is perfectly just. God doesn't punish innocent people.
Therefore, Job, you must have done something incredibly wicked in secret to deserve this.
Which is so cruel.
Job's friends represent the desperate human need to maintain the illusion of a safe, predictable, purely logical universe.
Because if Job is innocent and suffering, it means the universe is arbitrary and terrifying.
Exactly. They would rather blame the victim, they would rather accuse their friend of secret sins, than face the terrifying psychic fact that God might be acting unjustly.
They are defending their neat little theological dogma against the messy, brutal reality of human experience.
Which is precisely what makes Job's reaction so incredibly brilliant and revolutionary in the history of human consciousness.
Job refuses to play their game. He knows he is innocent, he has searched his soul, and he knows he hasn't broken the rules.
Therefore, he arrives at a terrifying realization.
That God is completely at odds with himself. The ultimate judge is actively breaking the law.
Job realizes he is dealing with an antinomy,
An antinomy.
a fundamental contradiction within the divine nature. God is both the ultimate justice and the perpetrator of ultimate injustice.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. Job is sitting in the ashes, holding the metaphorical legal contract of the covenant in his hand.
Right.
And he realizes that the judge, the jury, the prosecuting attorney, and the executioner are all the exact same unpredictable, unconscious entity.
An entity who isn't even reading his own rule book.
But in the midst of this absolute despair, Job makes a profound psychological leap.
He decides to appeal to the good God against the wrathful God.
He speaks that famous line, "For I know that my vindicator lives."
But I want to pause and put myself in the shoes of someone listening to this.
Okay, yeah.
If I'm Job, and the universe has just proven itself to be fundamentally, violently unfair,
Why not just give up? Job's own wife looks at him and says, "Curse God and die."
just end it.
Why does Job hold out for a fair hearing from a system that is clearly rigged?
That is the crucial difference between a conscious human being and an unconscious force of nature. Job recognizes the dual nature of Yahweh.
He sees both sides.
As certain as he is of the evil, the arbitrariness, and the sheer sadism he is currently experiencing, he is equally certain of the good, the justice, and the covenantal promise.
He realizes that Yahweh is both the persecutor tearing him apart and the ultimate helper who could save him.
Job refuses to give up his own internal integrity. He insists on holding the tension of these opposites.
He insists on a confrontation, and his sheer stubborn refusal to back down literally forces God's hand.
Job creates a moral obstacle that absolute power cannot simply ignore or swat away.
But when Yahweh finally shows up to answer Job, he doesn't bring an apology.
No, not at all. He doesn't say, "My bad, Satan tricked me."
He answers from the whirlwind.
This is one of the most magnificent, poetic, and psychologically revealing passages in all of human literature.
Yahweh appears in a tempest, a literal storm of chaos.
And spends 71 verses doing absolutely nothing but boasting about his raw physical power.
He unleashes this barrage of rhetorical questions. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades?
Can you draw out Leviathan with a fishhook?
He spends paragraphs detailing the creation of these terrifying, chaotic monsters, Behemoth and Leviathan, and he challenges Job to a fight.
He says, "Gird up your loins like a man, I will question you, and you shall declare to me."
He treats Job, a guy sitting in a garbage dump covered in boils, who has lost everything, as if Job were a heavily armed rival god.
When you look at it psychologically, you have to ask, why use a nuclear weapon to swat a fly?
Right. Why this massive, overwhelming defensive display of power against a broken mortal man?
Because Yahweh isn't actually arguing with Job.
Job never once doubted God's power. Job's entire argument was about God's justice.
Exactly. Yahweh's furious display of cosmic power is a massive psychological overcompensation.
He is trying to shout down his own dawning realization that he made a catastrophic mistake.
His omniscience is finally starting to catch up with his actions. He realizes he was bamboozled by his own trickster son.
He tortured his most loyal servant, and he broke his own moral code.
It's like, well, think of a CEO of a massive corporation.
Oh, I like this analogy. Let's hear it.
A CEO who knows they just made an illegal, catastrophic business decision that completely ruined a loyal employee's life.
Okay.
And when that employee finally gets a meeting and points out the specific broken rule, the CEO doesn't apologize.
Instead, the CEO starts screaming at the top of their lungs about how much money the company makes.
Exactly. How big the corporate skyscraper is, how they built the entire industry from scratch with their bare hands.
The CEO projects all of their own fear, their own guilt, and their own weakness onto the employee, trying to crush them with scale instead of answering the moral question.
That is a brilliant way to look at it, because it highlights how power reacts when it is morally cornered.
Yahweh is identifying with Behemoth and Leviathan, these massive, amoral, unconscious monsters of chaos.
Because he is recognizing his own monstrous, unintegrated nature.
And Job's reaction to this screaming whirlwind is a tactical masterpiece of psychological survival.
Job says, "Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth."
He submits.
But he submits prudently. He doesn't say, "You are right and I am wrong."
He essentially says, I recognize that I am dealing with a force of nature.
By yielding to raw, amoral power, by recognizing that Yahweh is acting like an unconscious crocodile or a rhinoceros rather than a moral judge, Job gains the ultimate moral high ground.
He formally revokes his demand for justice because he realizes that you cannot demand justice from an earthquake.
He realizes the entity he is talking to literally does not possess the consciousness to understand the concept of fair play.
So what does this all mean for God? Does he just walk away feeling victorious?
Consciously, yes. Yahweh thinks he intimidated the opponent into silence.
He thinks his thunderbolts won the debate.
But the unconscious mind registers the deeper truth. The status quo has been permanently shattered.
The Creator has been forced to see his own monstrous back, the abysmal, dark, amoral forces within his own nature,
Reflected through the eyes of his mortal creature. And the creature has unequivocally morally surpassed the Creator.
Job remained faithful to his integrity while God was unfaithful to his own covenant.
It's a staggering thought and deeply unsettling if you really sit with it.
The human worm in the dust, the man with a lifespan of a few decades, is morally superior to the eternal architect of the cosmos.
And that kind of moral defeat cannot be ignored forever. Omniscience cannot be permanently suppressed.
This realization requires an internal revolution in the divine realm.
God has to evolve to catch up to the moral consciousness of humanity.
And according to Jung's reading of the biblical timeline, this evolution begins with the sudden, dramatic return of a long-forgotten figure to the divine court.
Right, the return of Sophia.
Sophia, wisdom.
Yes. Following the historical trauma of the Babylonian exile and the theological trauma of Job, we see a distinct shift in the biblical literature.
We see the rise of apocalyptic literature, and we get the wisdom literature books like Proverbs, Ecclesiasticus.
And suddenly, this figure of Sophia takes center stage.
She is described in these texts in incredibly beautiful, intimate terms. She is a co-eternal feminine spirit, a pneuma, who was with God at the very beginning of creation.
In Proverbs, she says, "When he established the heavens, I was there. I was by him as a master workman, and I was daily his delight."
Rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world and delighting in the children of man.
To understand why she emerges precisely at this moment, we have to look at the psychological necessity of the feminine principle in this specific context.
Yahweh's patriarchal perfectionism, his drive for absolute rigid adherence to the law, had led to a sterile, brutal power dynamic.
He demanded absolute obedience from a fundamentally flawed empirical humanity, and when they inevitably failed, he responded with catastrophic wrath.
Or, in Job's case, when a human succeeded perfectly at following the law, Yahweh still responded with catastrophic wrath just to win a cosmic bet.
Exactly. The drive for pure, untempered perfection is a blind alley. It leads to cruelty.
So Sophia brings what Jung calls completeness.
In Jungian terms, heavily influenced by alchemy and ancient mythology, the masculine principle logos is often associated with logic, structure, discrimination, and the drive toward an idealized, abstract perfection.
But the feminine principle eros is associated with connection, inclusion, relationship, nature, and the messy reality of the whole.
Let me make sure I'm translating this correctly for the listener. Are we saying that trying to be perfect actually makes you blind, while trying to be complete allows you to grow?
That is exactly the core of Jung's argument. Striving for absolute perfection requires you to cut off anything that is flawed, weak, or dark.
You have to sever your own shadow.
But when you cut off your shadow, you lose your grounding in reality. You become unconscious of your own capacity for evil, which is exactly what happened to Yahweh.
Completeness, on the other hand, means accepting the light and the dark, the good and the flawed, into a single integrated whole.
It is imperfect by definition because it includes the messiness of reality, but it is fertile. It can grow.
Perfection is sterile. Completeness is alive.
So Sophia brings the messy relational reality back to Yahweh. She represents a profound love for mankind.
She's associated with the city of Jerusalem, the tree of life, the sweet-smelling myrrh. It's like the return of a repressed conscience.
Yahweh has been acting like an unfeeling, detached tyrant or a blind storm, and suddenly his own internal feminine wisdom surfaces to remind him of relationship.
Of love, of the actual humans who are suffering down below.
She forces God to engage in a process the Greeks called anamnesis.
The act of deep, profound remembering. God must remember his absolute knowledge.
He must finally, consciously reflect on the terrible wrong that was done to Job. He can't just be a blind force of nature anymore.
Sophia's love for humanity influences Yahweh, leading him to an ultimate, universe-altering realization.
He realizes he owes humanity a debt.
Yes. To expiate the wrong done to man, to heal the massive cosmic rift caused by his own unconsciousness, God decides he must regenerate himself.
He can't just create another Adam out of the dirt from a distance.
He must actually enter into the human condition. He must suffer what Job suffered. God must become man.
This is the master plan of the incarnation, God deciding to be born of a woman.
But because Yahweh is still Yahweh, and Satan is still out there wandering the earth looking for ways to ruin everything, the process of incarnation requires an incredibly elaborate, protective master plan.
And this brings us to Mary, the second Eve.
To protect this new divine incarnation from Satan's interference, the theological framework introduces the dogma of the Immaculate Conception.
Now, many people confuse this with the virgin birth, but the Immaculate Conception actually refers to Mary's conception, right?
That's right. It is a crucial metaphysical mechanic. Being immaculately conceived means Mary was born entirely without the taint of original sin.
She is elevated by divine fiat to the status ante lapsum, the state of humanity before the fall of Adam and Eve.
Now, a listener steeped in traditional theology might hear this and say, well, of course, that makes perfect sense.
Right. If God is going to be born into the world, you want the vessel to be absolutely pure. You don't want the divine nature contaminated by human sin.
You need a perfect container. But what is Jung's psychological critique of this?
Jung points out a massive, devastating consequence of this dogma that most theologians completely overlook.
By removing the taint of original sin, by creating this perfect, unblemished vessel, you are fundamentally altering their nature.
Mary, and by extension Christ, are stripped of their true empirical humanity.
They aren't really human anymore.
No, they are gods walking the earth. They do not possess the dark shadow of original sin that every other human being wrestles with daily.
The perfectionist tendency of Yahweh strikes again. Jung quotes a brilliant Latin phrase to describe this. Figo propior lumina perdit.
The nearer to the sun, the more light is lost. Let's unpack that.
By pushing the feminine ideal of Mary so close to divine perfection, the true ideal of human completeness, which Sophia represented, is damaged.
The messy, flawed, shadow-bearing reality of empirical humanity is left behind.
God intended to become man to understand Job. But by insisting on absolute purity, God basically creates an avatar that is immune to the core human condition.
Think of it like a team of scientists trying to understand how human biology reacts to the common cold.
Okay.
But instead of studying people living in a crowded, dirty city, they run their experiment on a genetically modified human living inside a perfectly sterile, hermetically sealed vacuum chamber.
Yes, your subject is perfectly safe from contamination. Satan can't get in. But the results of your experiment are useless.
They don't actually reflect the real, messy, bacteria-filled world that humanity actually lives in.
It is an evasion of the very problem it was supposed to solve. So the profound psychological and theological question becomes, if Christ isn't fully human in an empirical sense, does the incarnation actually solve the problem created by Job?
Job was a regular, flawed guy who suffered unfairly. Does a perfect God suffering on a cross actually provide the answer?
On the surface, it seems like a failed experiment. Christ's life is this highly numinous myth. It fulfills all these ancient, powerful archetypes of the dying and resurrecting God.
Like Osiris in Egypt, or Tammuz, or even the prototype of Abel, the good son murdered by the dark brother.
But if he's not truly one of us, where is the resolution?
The resolution comes in one specific, agonizing moment. The true culmination of the incarnation doesn't happen during the miracles, and it doesn't even conclude with the physical crucifixion itself.
It happens when the divine perfection cracks.
You're talking about the cry on the cross.
Yes, Christ's despairing cry, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?"
In that single, shattering moment of absolute despair and doubt, the divine perfection is breached.
God truly, deeply experiences the terrifying, isolating suffering of mortal man. He experiences the exact agonizing abandonment and betrayal that Job felt sitting in the ashes.
In that scream of abandonment, the answer to Job is finally given. God tastes his own medicine.
It is incredibly powerful to think of it that way. The cosmic debt is acknowledged.
But the story doesn't end on the cross, and it doesn't end with the resurrection. Jung insists that the incarnation isn't a one-and-done historical event that we just read about in a book.
Far from it. Before he leaves, Christ promises the Paraclete, the Holy Ghost.
And he tells his followers something incredibly radical. You are gods.
The Holy Ghost, this divine spark, will not just reside in a perfect, immaculately conceived vessel anymore. It is going to dwell in regular, dirty, flawed, empirical human beings.
The incarnation is an ongoing, continuous process. God is continuing to incarnate in humanity right now.
Okay, this is where we have to bring in our other source, the guide on escaping the illusion.
Because if the incarnation is ongoing, that puts an unbearable weight on us today.
This actually perfectly explains that concept of escaping the illusion we saw in the text. The illusion being that we can just passively sit back while God does all the cosmic heavy lifting.
The continuing incarnation means that we, regular human beings listening to this right now, are the vessels for the divine conflict.
We are the ones carrying the tension between the light and the dark.
Yes. Look at how Jung interprets the sixth petition of the Lord's Prayer. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Traditionally, we think of this as asking God to keep us away from a bad crowd or bad habits.
But psychologically, what is Christ actually saying here? He is effectively begging Yahweh not to pull another job experiment on fragile humans.
That completely reframes the most famous prayer in history.
He knows his Father's track record. He knows the divine tendency to project doubt and demand absolute proof through suffering.
He's saying to Yahweh, please do not subject these fragile empirical humans to the unbearable tension of your dark side. They cannot survive a whirlwind.
It's a desperate warning.
It is. But despite the warning, the ongoing incarnation demands it. Christian ethics and the ethics of any deep conscious life force agonizing collisions of duty.
To be a fully conscious human being is to suffer the tension of opposites. We have to escape the illusion that life is simple.
Let's look at the first steps to escape from the guide. The primary illusion we have to escape is this naive, almost childish optimism that the universe is purely good.
That God is only light, and that if we just follow the rules and act nice, bad things won't happen to us. Job proved that was a lie.
Escaping the illusion means recognizing that the universe contains immense, terrifying dark alongside immense, beautiful light.
We cannot hide behind a one-sided view of reality. We can't pretend the crocodile doesn't exist.
And then we arrive at the missing keys. If we are the vessels for this ongoing divine incarnation, what are the keys to surviving it?
The missing keys are conscious reflection and the courageous willingness to bear our own internal contradictions.
We are, as Jung so perfectly puts it, the culture medium in which the divine is trying to become conscious.
Think about a time in your life when you were faced with an impossible choice, a situation where every option caused harm.
Maybe you had to fire a friend to save a company, or you had to walk away from a toxic family member to save your own sanity.
You were torn apart by conflicting duties. According to this framework, that agonizing internal friction isn't just your personal psychology acting up.
You are experiencing the macrocosmic struggle of the universe within your own mind.
You are holding the tension of opposites. You are doing the hard work of consciousness that Yahweh initially refused to do.
So what does this all mean? It's like humanity was upgraded from being God's pets to being God's partners.
But the promotion comes with a terrifying amount of psychological responsibility. We have to carry the light and the dark.
And the consequences of failing to carry that burden are catastrophic.
Right, because if God is incarnating in all of us, and we are supposed to be successfully bearing this conflict, what do we make of the Book of Revelation?
The final book of the Bible is literally an apocalyptic vision of God returning in a fury of wrath, blood, and fire, destroying the world.
Doesn't that suggest that this whole experiment in human consciousness is a failure? That the dark side wins?
This raises one of the most urgent questions in Jung's entire analysis, and his psychological reading of the apocalypse is chilling.
Jung views the Book of Revelation not as a literal prediction of a future physical event, but as a dire psychological warning about the present.
Remember, the overarching Christian theological push was to define God as the summum bonum, the ultimate, pure, unadulterated good.
But if you insist that God is only good,
If you insist that God is only good, you repress the dark side. You lose the completeness that Sophia brought.
you go back to the sterile perfectionism.
And psychologically, we know exactly what happens to repressed energy. It doesn't disappear. It accumulates in the unconscious, growing darker, denser, and more volatile.
It ferments.
Yes. Jung views the terrifying imagery of Revelation, the beast, the plagues, the rivers of blood, as a representation of a dangerous, massive accumulation of repressed divine wrath and evil.
If we, as the human vessels of consciousness, insist on a purely one-sided goodness, if we refuse to acknowledge our own capacity for destruction, the unrecognized dark side will eventually erupt catastrophically.
The apocalypse is the psychological eruption of Yahweh's repressed shadow, hence the urgent, desperate need for human self-reflection.
We must hold the opposites within ourselves so that the repressed shadow doesn't tear the actual physical world apart.
The stakes literally could not be higher. It's not just about personal enlightenment. It's about the survival of the collective psyche.
Let's try to pull all of this together, because the journey we've just been on is staggering.
It really is. We started by looking at Yahweh's early profile, an amoral, unreflective force of raw power that broke its own covenants and lacked the self-awareness to understand why.
We witnessed the profound trauma of Job, an innocent man tortured because a deity was projecting its own unacknowledged inner doubts.
We saw Job's incredible tactical brilliance in the whirlwind. By refusing to argue logic with an earthquake, he secured the moral triumph of the creature over the creator.
Which necessitated the return of Sophia, the feminine principle of wisdom and completeness, forcing the divine to remember its connection to humanity.
And that memory, that love, led to God's desperate need to become human, to heal the cosmic rift through the incarnation.
A process that achieved its piercing climax, not in a display of power, but in a cry of absolute human despair on the cross.
And most importantly, we learned that this process is not ancient history. It is happening right now, within the messy empirical reality of our own minds.
We are the ongoing incarnation. We are the culture medium.
So to you, listening to this right now, the next time you are lying awake at 3 a.m., wrestling with a moral failure, or facing a collision of duties that feels like it's tearing you in half, Remember this deep dive.
Consider that you aren't just dealing with a personal neurosis. According to Jung's vision, you are the active site of cosmic evolution.
You are the universe trying to become conscious of itself. You hold the missing keys to escaping the illusion of a simple one-sided reality.
And if we connect this psychological reality to the ultimate trajectory of consciousness, it leaves us with a final, deeply provocative thought to ponder.
If the ultimate goal of the universe is to become fully conscious, and it relies entirely on empirical, flawed human beings to achieve that by bearing the agonizing tension of good and evil,
What happens if we refuse the task?
what happens to the cosmos and to us if we find the burden too heavy and choose the blind, easy comfort of remaining unconscious?
That is a terrifying and beautiful question. It brings us right back to the very beginning. The diagnostic landscape of the human soul and the divine image is murky. It is filled with blinding light and terrifying darkness.
But perhaps diving into that muddy water, embracing the completeness of the shadow and the light, rather than demanding the sterile perfection of an illusion, is exactly what we are meant to do.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the illusions, keep holding the tension of opposites, and keep exploring the incredible, terrifying depths of the human psyche. We'll see you next time.